Pericles and Athens by A.R. Byrne, The Golden Age of Greece, seen through the life of our leading statesman. And chapter 12 is Peace or War? What is it good for? Well, not what is it good for, but peace or war. Sparta had shown that she disapproved of Corinth's adventure in the northwest. But the Athenian alliance with Kerkyra had alarmed Peloponnesian opinion, and a war party was growing. Pericles used the respite in making ready for what he was sure must come. It has been believed by many moderns, following a theory mentioned with reserve by Plutarch, that Pericles provoked the Peloponnesian War in order to restore his own position, shaken by the attacks on his friends, all according to Plutarch in quick succession, and by a threatened attack on his own administration of finance. Alcibiades, hearing that his guardian was too busy to see him one day because he was working out how to give his accounts to the people, is said to have commented, "He'd do better to work out how not to give them." The remark sounds likely enough, but that Pericles took the hint is a large assumption. In fact, the attacks on his friends may have been spread over many years, and the attack on his accounts have taken place during the war. See 116 to 118, so 50 pages back, 157 and 199, so we still have some of it to come. Thucydides makes it quite clear that Pericles, at the beginning of the war and just before it, was as much the acknowledged leader of Athens as he had ever been. Nevertheless, Pericles did advise the assembly against concessions. Potential enemies must not control Corfu and the way to the west, but it is also likely that the personal motives weighed with him, at least to the extent that he was convinced that he could save Athens, especially from her own great fault of overconfidence, and no one else could, which was only too true. If then there was to be a war, one more war to confirm Athens' new order, it had better be soon, while he, Pericles, already over 60, was there to lead it. Pericles, the Alcmeonid, was a politician and a lover of power, in spite of the Parthenon. And one of the great problems of politics nowadays is this: it has to be a particular leader, or it's never going to do it. How do we save our democracy if anybody other than who I want to elect is being elected? And the politicians themselves saying, no one else can do it. It's like, well, it's pretty much everything you're doing part of a collective effort. So Pericles and his associates used the last years of peace to prepare for war, probably in the civil year 434 to 433, and the state finances were reorganized under two detailed decrees proposed by a certain Callias. The name is a common one, but the proposer was probably a leading general of this time, son of Calliades, a name also current in the great family of the heralds. Under one of these acts, which were both passed on one day, it is provided that after the completion of a reserved fund of 3,000 talents in Athenian coined money deposited in the treasury of Athena, evidently under an earlier act, debates to the other debts to the other gods shall be paid off. Athens had probably borrowed from the temple treasuries to finance the building program, especially before the battle over the use of league funds was won. To this end are to be applied the surpluses of both league and internal revenue. A new body of treasurers of the other gods, parallel to the existing treasurers of Athens, is established to take joint charge of both funds, which are all to be stored in the closed bank chamber of the Parthenon. Finally, when all outstanding debts have been paid, surplus funds shall be added to those available for maintenance of the walls and the naval arsenal. Now, worshipping a god who is the inheritor might make more sense than a god that's, but it's sort of what we expect is kind of like the opposite of Lucifuge Raphael providing us money or that sort of thing where that witches may do. It's that, helping, being a part of one's of the Satanist experience, and then the Satanist providing, stuff either to make the experience possible or as payment for the experience, probably both. So there's a lot of disappointment in pact making. They think, oh, if I just perform this spell, I'm going to be rich. But no, it's the opposite. People make promises. If this happens, then this is going to happen, whether or not the entity helped them or not. In the way asked for. Under the second degree, it is directed that the Propylaea and certain other works on the Acropolis be finished off under plans provided by the architect Mnesicles. 10 talents a year are provided for maintenance and repairs, and it is forbidden under heavy penalties to make any other payments exceeding 10,000 drachmas, 1 2/3 talents, from Athena's treasury, except urgent repairs, without a special vote of indemnity from the assembly. This was the regular method of safeguarding a reserve fund. Thus, under the first decree, Athens was provided with two reserve funds. When war broke out, Pericles was able to announce they had amounted to 6,000 talents. And under the second, the great building program was wound up, and a policy of retrenchment on peace expenditure introduced. The completion of Mnesicles' original design for the two great wings of the Propylaea would have to wait for a more propitious time, but that time never came. And remember, the talents is like a person's weight of gold, or silver or something. So this is an extreme amount of money. And nowadays we see how whole countries can be provided for by these. 6,000. Well, so that's not too much. It's like, 6,000. Are you kidding me? That would be like 600,000. More than that. I can't think exactly, but it's like a person's weight worth of gold, or silver or something. So I'm not calculating too well, so I'm going to stop. It was probably the same Callias who, in the new civil year, which began at midsummer in 433, probably proposed the decree renewing the Western alliances with Leontinoi and Rhegion. He must have been one of Pericles' leading lieutenants, but his fame was brief. He was killed in action in 432 while commanding the Athenian forces operating against Potidæa, a Corinthian colony, which was also a member of the state of the Delian League, and which, at this junction, revolted with the active support of a volunteer brigade from its mother city. In 432, then Athenian and Corinthian troops, with other Peloponnesian mercenaries, had met in a pitched battle before Potidæa and Callias's army, less its commander and 150 more Athenians, also besieging a leading Corinthian general in that city. Also before Potidæa openly revolted, its government had sent secret emissaries to Sparta, and Sparta, that is to say, some or all of the ephors, the annual magistrates for the year, had promised, if Athens used force against Potidæa, to intervene in arms, striking evidence of a change in feeling since the Corfu episode. Sparta was not unanimous for war, even now. The old king Archidamus, who knew what war with Athens would mean, headed for the peace party, but Pericles, having decided that war, or at least a showdown and a trial of strength, was now inevitable, took his own measures. At this very moment, when all was in the balance, Athens took economic sanctions against another of Sparta's allies, Megara, accusing the Megarians of having sinned against the gods by plowing up sacred land. The sort of excuse was a common form when one intended to pick a quarrel. She excluded all Megarian trade from the harbors and markets of the empire by what came to be known as the Megarian decree. Athens had not forgotten how the Megarians in 446 had massacred their Athenian garrison, a garrison which they themselves had called in 12 years earlier to save them from Corinth. Relations had no doubt been bad ever since. But we know nothing of them. To this small, densely populated, eastward trading state, which had specialized in textile manufacturers for export, the decree meant slow starvation. This naturally added Megara's voice to the outcry already being raised at Sparta by Corinth. Other, if less serious, complaints against Athens multiplied. The people of the Aegina complained, through secret emissaries, that Athens was interfering in their internal affairs, contrary to the promise of autonomy in the Treaty of 445. Athens, as we have seen, was constantly infringing her allies' autonomy in practice, either on grounds of security or of economic expediency. The ukase that states of the League were not to trade with Megara was such an infringement in itself. In these circumstances, Sparta invited delegates from her allies to address the Spartan assembly on the Athenian question. Corinthian envoys had been canvassing vigorously for a 12-month, and delegate after delegate rose to complain of Athens as a bad neighbor and a danger to all. After letting others work upon Spartan feelings, as part of the prearranged plan, the Corinthian spokesman rose last to sum up the common grievances, and Thucydides puts into his mouth a vivid picture of the sanguine, restless, and daring Athenian character, which had accomplished so much and roused such bitter hatred and fear. And some of the people in American government who have tried to prevent the war crimes and the and maybe usury or something else that would cause people to hate America. the sanctions and that sort of thing. People who have stood in the way, tried to decrease some of the ill feeling and prevent reasons for people to go after this country. And they've been treated like, oh, these are the enemies of the state, when they very well could be the best friends of the state. But, because the time is going that maybe it shouldn't be America World Police. Isn't that the name of a very poor movie? But it now remained for the Spartans, without presence of strangers, to consider whether the pressure to be exerted on Athens should be carried to the point of an early declaration of war or not. But there was one further intervention. Some Athenian envoys happened, Thucydides says, to be in Sparta on other business, and they asked permission to address the meeting. It was granted, and an Athenian spokesman came forward. The speech that follows is an extraordinary performance. It is reasonable to consider its main lines to be those of a speech actually made, not a free composition by Thucydides, for the reasons that Thucydides, as a rising politician, had every opportunity of hearing about it. It is emphatically not the speech on the case for Athens that one would expect, and Thucydides tells us, not in speech, that the ambassadors decided not to reply to the specific charges against Athens, but simply to advise the Spartans to take care. Sometimes the true strength is trying to, make peace with your neighbors. The whole speech is, in fact, truculent, arrogant, and provocative. In view of all this outcry against us, we propose not to answer the charges. You're not our judges, but to warn you against being persuaded into an imprudent decision on a serious issue. It is necessary to mention our services in the Persian Wars, however tired people may be of our continually referring to them. Mention of Marathon, Salamis, Themistocles, etc. duly follows. You Spartans let us down by your slowness, but we saved you all the same. We gained our empire, not by conquest, but because you backed out of continuing the war against Persia, and the allies themselves asked us to take the lead. Naturally, later, when a feeling was turning against us, and there had been some attempted successions, we could not lay down our power. It is an eternal law that the weaker is ruled by the stronger. We deserve our position. You thought so too until it suited you to start talking about justice. We are, in fact, fairer than most people would be in our position, and as a direct result, the Allies grumble, because in self-defense, we have transferred some commercial lawsuits from the empire to our own perfectly fair courts at Athens, instead of considering how other people treat their subjects, how the Persians, for example, treated them themselves. If you should ever demolish us and succeed to our position, you will soon lose your present popularity. If you behave as you did in the Persian Wars, for the Spartan code at home is unlike anyone else's, but when you go abroad, you do not abide by either that or the common customs of Greece. The speaker ends with a patronizing warning that war is a chancy business. Sparta had better be careful. And we've seen all along in this program, at least, that the Greeks weren't very tolerant. It'd be one thing if people are just being criminals, but criminalizing different spiritual or material culture, and it was definitely a problem. Oh, you can't express different spiritual beliefs than we are. It's like, all right. What one may ask could any intelligent Athenian expect to be the effect of such a speech at such a moment? What its effect was appears in the sequel. Well, if their discipline is something they have at home and in other countries, that's a commendable thing, because you hear of people like you hear literally of fatwas saying, oh, if you do the following haram things in other countries, it's halal, or maybe you just have to keep the law. So people go to other countries to commit adultery and do drugs and even worse things, or at least they go there in the way that, oh well, the criminal penalties are less. Back home, they'll kill me for this. I am more likely to get away with it entirely in such and such country. So people do that. Of course, your typical immigrant is not here because America doesn't have the death penalty for the worst offenses. The Spartans debated by themselves. Speaker after speaker gave his opinion, mostly for war. At last came forward the veteran king Archidamus to plead for caution. Sparta was not ready for war, not with the great maritime and financial power of Athens. This would be a long war, a very different matter from a land campaign inside the Peloponnese. Athens could only be brought down by subverting her allies, and the Peloponnesian League was too weak at sea to even relieve the cities which did not revolt. The only damage that Sparta could do Athens was to devastate her territory. It was most unlikely that this would bring Athens to her knees, and consequently, it was sound strategy not to resort to this step at once, but keep it as a threat, like a hostage, who could only be killed once. Athens had already expressed her willingness to submit to arbitration. The question whether any of her proceedings contravened the treaty of 445, Sparta should make representations. Certainly, and back them with preparations for war, but there should be no ultimatum yet. But his counsel fell upon deaf ears. The next speaker was the Ephor, presiding over the assembly in person, and he harked straight back to the speech of the Athenian. He had failed to follow this long oration. He said, a favorite gambit with Spartans, who prided themselves on their laconic, i.e., Laconian brevity. The Athenians had praised themselves at great length, but they had not shown that they were not wronging Sparta's allies. Others may have maritime and financial power, but we have loyal allies and must not betray them. Hesitation would better befit the intending aggressor than the defender. And with that he called for a vote worthy of Sparta, and using his powers as presiding officer that no voice might be heard after his, put the question to the vote. Did Sparta consider that the Athenians had broken the treaty? Not content with the usual primitive Spartan method of voting by acclamation, he called for a division. There was a large majority for war. It is clear that the unnamed Athenian speech had contributed not a little to this result, but we have still not answered the question. What did the Athenian envoys expect of such a speech? That Athenian ambassadors were so obtuse as to not realize what the effect would be is almost unthinkable, but the only alternative is that the speech was a piece of deliberate sabotage at the outset of the peace or war negotiations. It is scarcely likely that the ambassadors ventured on such a step on their own initiative, and so one is almost forced to the conclusion that their accidental presence at Sparta was no accident at all, that the leading men of Athens, that is to say, that Pericles, hearing of the proposed congress at Sparta, had made an excuse to send an embassy on the other matters, privately briefed, to take the line that they took. Here, as in the Megarian decree, and in Pericles' whole attitude to the crisis, we find evidence of his consistent attitude, that if war must come, it had better come while he was there to control it. No war of annihilation, a war in fact, with as little bloodshed as might be, a strictly limited war, which would show the Peloponnesian hotheads that their spears were impotent against the walls of Athens, and that Athens could hit back at sea with stinging pinpricks on the coast of Laconia, and with ruinous effect against Corinth and Megara. In a few years at latest, the enemy's impetus would be exhausted. The land of Attica would suffer. But the Peloponnesians, the one solid combination in the Greek world outside Athens' own empire, would retire with irretrievable loss of prestige, hopelessly baffled in a war of their own choosing. Even before that, Megara might well have been starved into surrender. After it, sure as fate, disintegration would commence. And then perhaps, who knows, perhaps at last the general Greek federation and the Athenian peace? Sparta was committed. But though the Corinthians clamored for speedy action to save Potidæa, King Archidamus was in no hurry. The influential peace party still worked hard for delay, hoping against hope that Athens would make some concessions before, in the Greek phrase, anything irremediable had happened. Sparta had still to call a further congress of allied delegates, this time of plenipotentiaries, to vote on whether they endorsed Sparta's decision that Athens had broken the treaty, to the accompaniment of further Corinthian lobbying. They voted for war, a war to win a stable peace, said the Corinthians. But even now, there was no campaign in 432. Preparations were set on foot for the spring, and meanwhile there was as much coming and going of Spartan embassies to Athens. The first demand was that Athens should expel the accursed of the goddess, of reference to the curse of Alcmeonidae, which was almost exactly 200 years old that year. The reason for this demand, apart from its being common form to choose a religious pretext when one intended to pick a quarrel, was of course to strike at Pericles, from the opinion, says Thucydides, that if he were banished, Athens would be easier to deal with. Then they had not much hope of achieving this actual result, but hoped to injure his popularity by rousing the feeling that the war was going to be largely about him. For, adds Thucydides, in a sentence fatal to the theory that Pericles' position was seriously shaken, he was the most powerful man of his generation, and in his leadership of the state he opposed the Spartans at every point, and was against concessions, urging the Athenians to war. The transparent attack on him was a complete failure, merely increasing, if that were possible, his prestige. The Athenians merely replied by calling upon Sparta to expel those tainted by 2 breaches of sanctuary, both at the expense of revolutionaries in the last 50 years. But, okay, I'm going to close there, but wouldn't you say that if they needed to find a religious excuse, it might delay war if they had to look for these justifications?